of the lecture series, The Missing Pages of World History, in honor of Dr. John Henry Clarke. Now, I do this lecture series once a year as community service and also in honor of Dr. John Henry Clarke, who exposed me to a portion of African history that, although I'd majored in African American studies in college and history and got my master's in Africana studies, I had never, ever, ever been exposed to the epic of African history that Dr. John Henry Clarke first exposed me to. And this was absolutely mind-blowing for me. Let me share the screen so I want you guys to see a picture of Dr. John Henry Clarke. For those of you who are not aware of who Dr. John Henry Clarke is, he was a phenomenal master teacher. He was born way, 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 way back in the days, I believe in like 1915 on New Year's. He was born in Alabama and moved to New York when he was 18 during essentially the early stages and the height of the Harlem Renaissance. When he first went to New York, he went to be mentored by the famous Arturo Schomburg, who's the namesake of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York, who was one of the leading bibliophiles of the era. He was friends with Malcolm X. He was friends with Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first prime minister of independent Ghana. He mentored Dr. James Turner, who was one of my mentors at Cornell. He mentored a whole generation of black people beyond slavery, beyond slavery, beyond slavery. And it's important for me to mention that because one of the things that I try not to do when I teach African history is really deal with the period of enslavement too much, because there is an overemphasis on such a short period of African history when the totality of African history spans the totality of human history. Yet for whatever reason, everything that's centered on the black man's history is centered on the epic of his history when he is at his lowest. So this lecture series is about fighting propaganda. This lecture series is not just teaching you world history. It's not just teaching you African history, but it is battling pernicious racism and propaganda that continues to shape the discourse about African history, who black people are, and it is the reason why white supremacy still is able to not only exist, but to thrive. So I want to thank Dr. John Henry Clarke once again for being the pioneering teacher, the master teacher that he was for his entire life. So I'm going to read now a selection from Dr. John Henry Clarke. Because when we think about why the need to study African history, why the need to make the study of African history, the study of black history, a separate and individual pursuit, why the need? And this is from Why Africana History by Dr. John Henry Clarke. Africa and its people are the most written about and the least understood of all of the world's people. This condition started in the 15th and the 16th centuries with the beginning of the slave trade system. The Europeans not only colonized most of the world, they began to colonize information about the world and its people. In order to do this, they had to forget or pretend to forget all they had previously known about the Africans. They were not meeting them for the first time. There had been another meeting during Greek and Roman times. At that time, they complemented each other. The African Clitus Niger, king of Bactria, was also a cavalry commander for Alexander the Great. Most of the Greeks' thinking was influenced by this contact with the Africans. The people and the cultures of what is known as Africa are older than the word Africa itself. According to most records, old and new, Africans are the oldest people on the face of the earth. The people now called Africans not only influenced the Greeks and the Romans, they influenced the early world before there was a place called Europe. When the early Europeans first met Africans at the crossroads of history, it was a respectful meeting, and the Africans were not slaves. Their nations were old before Europe was born. In this period of history, what was to be later known as Africa was an unknown place to the people who would someday be called Europeans. Only the people of some of the Mediterranean islands and a few states of what would become the Greek and Roman areas knew of parts of North Africa, and that was a land of mystery. After the rise and decline of Greek civilization and the Roman destruction of the city of Carthage, they made the conquered territories into a province which they called Africa, a word derived from Afri and the name of a group of people about whom little is known. At first, the word applied only to the Roman colonies in North Africa. There was a time when all dark-skinned people were called Ethiopians, for the Greeks referred to Africa as, quote, the land of the burnt-faced people. In Africa in general, if Africa in general is a man-made mystery, Egypt in particular is a bigger one. There has long been an attempt on the part of some European quote-unquote scholars to deny that Egypt was a part of Africa. To do this, they had to ignore the great masterpieces on Egyptian history written by European writers such as Ancient Egypt, Light of the World, volumes 1 and 2, and a whole school of European thought that placed Egypt in proper focus in relation to the rest of Africa. The distorters of African history also had to ignore the fact that the people of the ancient land, which would later be called Egypt, never called their country by that name. It was called Tameri or Kamt, and sometimes Kemet or Sais. The ancient Hebrews called it Mizraim. Later, the Muslim Arabs used the same term, but later discarded it. Both the Greeks and the Romans referred to the country as the Pearl of the Nile. The Greeks gave it the simple name Egypticus. Thus, the word we now know as Egypt is of Greek origin. Until recent times, most Western scholars have been reluctant to call attention to the fact that the Nile River is 4,000 miles long, that it starts in the south, in the heart of Africa, and flows to the north. It was the world's first cultural highway. Thus, Egypt was a composite of many African cultures. In his article, The Lost Pharaohs of Nubia, Professor Bruce Williams infers that the nations in the south could be older than Egypt. This information is not new. When rebel European scholars were saying this 100 years ago and proving it, they were not taken seriously. It is unfortunate that so much of the history of Africa has been written by conquerors, foreigners, missionaries, and adventurers. The Egyptians left the best record of their history written by local writers. It was not until near the end of the 18th century, when a few European scholars learned to decipher their writing, that this was understood. The Greek traveler Herodotus was in Africa about 450 BC. His eyewitness account is still a revelation. He witnessed African civilization in decline and partly in ruins after many invasions. However, he could still see the indications of the greatness that it had been. In this period of history, the Nile Valley civilization of Africa had already brought forth 2 golden ages of achievement and had left its mark for all the world to see. Slavery and colonialism strained but did not completely break the cultural umbilical cord between the Africans in America and those who, by forced migration, now live in what is called the Western world. A small group of African American and Caribbean writers, teachers, and preachers collectively developed the basis of what would be an African consciousness movement over 100 years ago. Their concern was with Africa in general, Egypt and Ethiopia, and what we now call the Nile Valley. Our own great historian W.E.B. Du Bois tells us, "Always Africa has given us something new. On its black bosom arose one of the earliest, if not the earliest, of self-protecting civilizations, and grew so mightily that it still furnishes superlatives to thinking and speaking men. Out of its darker and more remote forest vastness came, if we may credit many recent scientists, the first welding of iron, And we know that agriculture and trade flourished there when Europe was a wilderness. Egypt and the nations of the Nile Valley were, figuratively, the beating heart of Africa and the incubator for its greatness for more than 1,000 years. Egypt gave birth to what later would become known as Western civilization, long before the greatness of Greece and Rome. W.E.B. Du Bois further tells us that nearly every human empire that has arisen in the world, material and spiritual, has found some of its greatest crises on this continent of Africa. It was through Africa that Christianity became the religion of the world. It was through Africa that Islam came to play its great role of conqueror and civilizer. This is a part of the African story, and in the distance, it is a part of the African American story. It is difficult for depressed African Americans to know that they are a part of the larger story of the history of the world. The history of the modern world was made, in the main, by what was taken from Black African people. There is no way to go directly to the history of African Americans without taking a broader view of African world history. For African Americans, Carter G. Woodson led the way and used what was then called Negro History Week to call attention to his people's contribution to every aspect of world history. Dr. Woodson, then director of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, conceived this special week as a time when public attention should be focused on the achievements of America's citizens of African descent. The acceptance of the facts of African American history and the African American historian as a legitimate part of the academic community did not come easily. Slavery ended and left its false images of Black people intact. Early white American historians did not accord African people anywhere a respectful place in their commentaries on the history of man. In the closing years of the 19th century, African American historians began to look at their people's history from their vantage point and their point of view. Dr. Benjamin Quirks observed that as early as 1883, this desire to bring to public attention the untapped material on the Negro prompted George Washington Williams to publish his 2-volume History of the Negro Race in America from 1619 to 1880. The first formally trained African-American historian was W.E.B. Du Bois, whose doctoral dissertation, published in 1895, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade to the United States, 1638 to 1870, became the first title to be published in the Harvard Historical Studies. It was with Dr. Carter G. Woodson, another PhD, that African world history took a great leap forward and found a defender who could document his claims. Woodson was convinced that unless something was done to rescue the Black man from history's oversight, he would become a negligible factor in the thought of the world. Woodson in 1915 founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Woodson believed that there was no such thing as Negro history. He said what was called Negro history was only a missing segment of world history. He devoted the greater portion of his life to restoring this segment. To understand fully any aspect of African American life, one must realize that the African American is not without a cultural past, though he was many generations removed from it before his achievements in American literature and art commanded any appreciative attention. Africana, or Black history, should be taught every day, not only in the schools, but also in the home. African History Month should be every month. All right. That was from Why Africana History by Dr. John Henry Clarke. I'm going to go now to our world history timeline. What I plan to do for this lecture series is to begin the study of human history where it originates, on the continent of Africa over 200,000 years ago. There is not a scientist, anthropologist, paleontologist, geneticist. There is no learned people today that will look you in your face and tell you that all human beings did not come from Africa. That's a foregone conclusion. So one of the premises of this whole lecture series is if all human beings, if every single human being originated from the continent of Africa, why is it that we know so little about Africa? If African people are in fact the oldest people on the planet, why is it that we learn so little about African history? If Africa is the birthplace of civilization, why in American public schools do we start history with Western civilization? Why is history in American public schools taught as if Western civilization was the progenitor of all of the education and knowledge that came forth within Western civilization? There is a very, very strategic reason why African history has been removed and distorted. And that reason is very, very simple. If you truly study world history from its genesis in Africa, the only conclusion that you could come to is that African people were brilliant. Is that African people originated virtually every form of knowledge known to man. The reality is very simple. And let's just use logic for a little bit. Here is our world timeline. We now know that human beings, modern human beings who look like you and I, originated, at first it was thought, around 200,000 years ago. And it was believed that the oldest human beings, well, the oldest fossils came from Ethiopia in the Omo region. And that was dated around 195,000 years ago. Now we have, as of 2017, there has been another discovery of anatomically modern human beings that look like you and I that was discovered in Morocco. And it's thought to be over 200,000 years old. 300,000 years old. But once again, all of not just modern anatomical human beings, but all of the earliest hominid species are all found to have originated in Africa. Okay? With the exception of the Neanderthals. But we'll talk about that later. Now, when we look at this world history timeline, I want you to note some things. This is where, the far left is where human history begins, 200,000 years ago. Ancient Kemet, the Nile Valley civilizations began as early as 10,500 BC. Ancient Kemet, as we see it and know it today, is supposedly around 3150 BC. The Greeks are the oldest of the Europeans, the Greeks. Here, 3150 BC is the formation of ancient Egypt. 900 BC, this is the time period in which the oldest of the Europeans, the Greeks, came out of their dark ages. Prior to 900 BC, there is nothing that could be considered civilization going on in anywhere in Europe. Nowhere. 900 BC, the Europeans, the oldest of the Greeks, the oldest of the Europeans, come out of their dark ages. 332 BC is when Alexander the Great conquers ancient Egypt. 30 BC is when the Romans, after Cleopatra, captured ancient Egypt. So I want you to see how many years went by before Black Africa was finally conquered by Europeans. You're talking over 2,000 years. Over 2,000 years of pharaonic rule was the civilization of ancient Kemet. Because the civilization of ancient Kemet lasted for so long, it is why we have so many monuments from ancient Kemet. It is why they had so much time to study and develop and perfect. The first of the Greeks started coming to ancient Egypt as early as the 700 BCs. And they were welcomed as students. They did not pose a threat to the civilization of ancient Kemet. So the people of ancient Kemet allowed them to come in and celebrate in the civilization that they developed. But just like you will see, all of the people that African people allowed to freely come and enjoy the fruits of African civilization turned on the host. It wasn't enough for us to invite them into our home, share with them everything that we've developed. That wasn't enough. Eventually, every foreigner who Africans opened the door and let them into their home, once they saw how beautiful the home was, they wanted the home. And they wanted us out of the home. This is the story of African world history. African people minding their business. African people not being imperialistic. And this is very, very, very important for all of you to understand. And that is, Africa was the light of the world, was the wealthiest civilization for not hundreds of years, but over 2,000 years. For over 2,000 years. So with this being the case, and we know for certain that the civilization of ancient Egypt was Black African, how can you erase over 2,000 years of successful civilization? Why would you hide that? Everyone today knows that there are not any of the wonders of the world that remain of the old world, other than the Great Pyramids of Giza. And all of this have outlasted invasions, earthquakes, sandstorms, all types of weather. And you can go there now and still see paint on buildings, which lets you know how sophisticated they were with chemistry. We talk about geometry with the Pythagorean theorem, which we all know was a calculation that he got from ancient Kemet. Who in their right mind can look at the Great Pyramids of Giza and say that anybody other than the people who built those pyramids came up with the mathematical formula for determining the square of a triangle, square root of a triangle? So, This lecture series, once again, it's not just about you learning history. It's about you learning history from the origins of history so that you can understand how it came to be that African history has been omitted from the record, and how it came to be that Western civilization is now written about as the founder of everything great. The only way that you can sell that is if you erase all of this history. The only way that you can sell white supremacy is if you erase ancient African history. That is the only way that you can do it. And people, this is important. And it's important because if we allow ourselves to stay centered on only studying African American history, you lose ancient Egypt. You lose all of the genius that the African people brought forth to create the most magnificent civilization ever known to man. My self-esteem, my independence, my love of my history and culture, it did not come from studying African American history. It did not come from studying slavery. It did not come from being bogged down day after day reading about enslavement, 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 enslavement. Imagine if we spent the same amount of time that we spent studying enslavement, studying African genius, studying the civilization, the greatest civilization, the grandest civilization, the most morally intact civilization. And when I say the most morally intact, I mean that. When you study the history of African world history, which we're going to do through this lecture series, you're going to see that African people, although they had the power, when they were in power, what did they do? Did they go travel the world to conquer other less developed people? Did they travel the world trying to cheat other peoples out of everything? Is that the history that you know about of ancient Africa? No. But when you study Western civilization, you get introduced to Western philosophers, Kant, Hegel, Hume, Montesquieu, Locke. And all of these philosophers you're learning are telling you how human nature is, not European human nature in general. And many of their ideas about human nature were terrible. They thought that the human being, the individual nature of human beings was so terrible that human beings would naturally want to form a government for their protection. That's not African. That's not an African trait. Those are European traits, but were applied to all human beings. So you guys are going to have a treat because you're going to learn about yourselves. You're going to learn about Africa. You're going to learn about African history in a way that you never had before. You're going to learn about world history in a way that you never had before. And the great thing about everything right now is that we're living in the information age. We're living in the digital era. We're living with the internet age. So all of the evidence is at our fingertips. When people like Dr. Carter G. Woodson were writing, what do you think he had at his disposal? So this is why we give so much praise to the black historians who were able to shift through so much to find the true history of black people, of African people. It was not something they could just go to their desk, turn on a laptop, and Google search names, and it would come up. So we owe black historians a hell of a debt for keeping true African history in the forefront of African people, not just in America, but all over the world. I'm going to show you a clip now of the Chinese and their attempt at trying to prove that they were not descendant from Africa, that they were, in fact, descendant from Homo erectus in Asia and had nothing to do with black people, African people. Their stock ain't come from the African continent. I'm going to share to you what came of that.
However, there is something that could settle this debate of where the Chinese come from once and for all. I'm meeting Professor Jin Li, one of China's leading geneticists. Recently, he led a project that set out to prove that the Chinese evolved independently from everyone else, from Homo erectus, here in China.
Before the project started, I was hoping that I could identify or could be able to find evidence that support independent origin of Chinese in China, because I'm a Chinese and came from China, and through the education process, I always believed that there's something special about Chinese.
He singled out a male genetic marker which only appeared about 80,000 years ago in Africa. So any man who carries that marker must have recent African ancestors and can't be descended from the more ancient Asian Homo erectus. Jin took DNA from over 160 ethnic groups around East Asia. Over 12,000 samples. And so, what did you find?
We did not see even one single individual that could be considered as the descendant of the Homo erectus in China. Rather, everybody was a descendant of our ancestors from Africa.
The result couldn't have been any clearer. How did that make you feel as a Chinese person?
After I saw the evidences that we generate in my laboratory, I think we should all be happy with that, because after all, modern humans from different part of the world are not so different from each other, and we are very close relatives.
It's great, thank you.
In the modern era, everyone wants to distance themselves from Africa, except when it comes to Africa's wealth. But I pose this question to all of you out there listening today. Let me ask you this question. During the time of ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet, do you think that there were any people on the planet who would have said that African people were inferior? Do you think that there were any people on the planet who could have visited the civilization of ancient Egypt and said that black African people were inferior? In fact, what would they perhaps have said? The opposite. The opposite. The very opposite. Think about the African kings and queens of Kemet. Think about them for a second. Thinking about dynasty after dynasty after dynasty. Can you imagine? You think they could imagine ever being called inferior? Do you think they would ever be able to conceptualize that throughout the course of world history, that everything that they developed would be attributed to somebody else that they taught, to the people they taught? Do you think that any of these people ever in a million years would have believed that they could create a monument that looked just like a black African person, painted brown just like a black African person, and African people be convinced that African people didn't do this? I mean, can you imagine how absurd that proposition would have been for an ancient African person in Kemet? Absolutely absurd. Absolutely absurd. So we're going to play with this timeline a lot because the importance of studying history from its genesis, from its origins, is that you get to clearly see who were the originators and who were the imitators. It's real easy. But if you erase all of this history and start the history here, it tells a whole different story. I never understood when I was young why we never studied history in order. I would say to myself, this is so confusing. It's hard for me to understand history when I'm learning about all of these different periods at different points. Why can't we just sit and learn history from the beginning and get to where we are right now today? And once again, that answer is in the politics of education. In the politics of education. Unit 1 of the Standing on the Shoulders of Giants deals exclusively with this whole idea of education as politics and propaganda. So a lot of this lecture series draws from the intro unit of the curriculum. So if you guys want a more in-depth study of what we're going over, please make sure that you check out our intro unit. For all the Black Achievement Fund members out there, this is free to you. Go to our members only page and you will have access to it. But I want to read to you some of the quotes, a few of the quotes of the European philosophers that Dr. John Henry Clarke was referencing. And these are 17th, 18th, 19th century philosophers. And once again, remember, the Greeks, the ancestors of all of these men who I'm about to read quotes from, their ancestors learned everything they knew from Egypt, from Black Africans, and openly acknowledged it. And all of these philosophers, they're reading their ancestors' work. So these philosophers, I don't believe, just out of the blue begin to think that African people had no history and all of these things. I don't believe that. I know that men who are as learned as they are, I know what they studied, who they studied. So this whole idea of putting together literature that says that African people contributed nothing to world history, to spread this propaganda all over the world, this was deliberate. This wasn't because they were ignorant. Let's hear what some of them had to say. There was never a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufacturers amongst them, no arts, no scientists. David Hume. Here he's saying nobody has ever been civilized other than white people. And he's writing in the time right after Europeans were civilized once again by the Arab Islamic Empire, who conquered Southern Europe from 711 AD to 1492. Here's Hegel. Africa is the land of childhood, removed from the light of self-conscious history and wrapped in the dark mantle of the night. The white race possesses all incentives and talents in itself. The race of Negroes can be educated, but only as slaves. The indigenous Americans cannot be educated. They care about nothing and are lazy. Once again, I challenge you, anybody out there listening to me, I challenge you to go and find any literature from ancient Kemet where Black African people were spreading propaganda saying that all non-Black people possess no talents, never been any genius among anybody other than African people. Even when we were demonstrating it. You never hear that. You'll never hear that. White Americans, certain people, want black people to think that if black people were in the same position as white people, that we would have done the same things. That if we had power, we would have did the same things. We had the power. We had the wealth. Did we do that? Did we do that? No, we did not do that. Dr. Carter G. Woodson was the second African American to receive a PhD from Harvard. There's a W.E.B. Du Bois Center at Harvard, but you find very little honoring an alum who is equally as illustrious as W.E.B. Du Bois, and that is Carter G. Woodson. Why? Carter G. Woodson wrote for the average black person who was barely literate. He wanted every single black person to be able to read positive things about her or himself. He didn't use highfalutin language and all of those types of things. He was also a supporter of Marcus Garvey. Staunch supporter of Marcus Garvey. And no one in the academy wants to acknowledge anything positive about Marcus Garvey, which is why we don't hear anything about him. Marcus Garvey led the largest black movement in the United States history up until today. And he's given short shrift in history books in America. Why? Because Americans don't want black people to look at a leader who was about Africa for the Africans, who was about black economic independence, black cultural integrity. They had to get rid of him. But they embraced the NAACP and the integrationists. So there's a lot that we need to understand about politics and education that we currently don't. There are a lot of strategies that we have employed that were successful, wildly successful. If the largest black movement ever in the history of the United States was a black movement for black economic independence and cultural protection, if that was the largest ever, why doesn't everyone know about that? Why aren't the current generation of black children exposed to individuals like him? Why? Because they don't want you to replicate those ideas. I'm gonna read to you a quick letter by Dr. Carter G. Woodson. As you can see, this is from the Association of the Study of Negro Life and History. This is October 1st, 1927, almost 100 years ago. This is what he's saying about black history. My dear Mr. Barnes, why establish a home study department? What need is there for such an effort? Why not let the established schools do this work? The answer is simple and clear. Recently, a Negro instructor in a college was asked to give a course in Negro history. He treated the request as a joke. He has been well instructed in the story of the Hebrews, the Greeks, and the Romans. He has made a special study of the achievements of Europeans and Americans. He has been taught that these nations accomplished all. From his point of view, therefore, there is no other history worth considering. The fact is that the so-called history teaching in our schools and colleges is downright propaganda, an effort to praise one race and to decry the other, to justify social repression and exploitation. The world is still in darkness as to the actual progress of mankind. Each corner of the universe has tended to concern itself merely with the exploits of its own particular heroes. Students and teachers of our time, therefore, are the victims of this selfish propaganda. The association is trying to bring before the world the whole truth, that the truth may make men free. To do this, it has decided not only to publish informing books, but to offer by mail instruction in Negro life and history. The Home Study Department has, therefore, been established for the special benefit of those who would like to study the aspects of African civilization which were neglected in the schools in which they were trained. These courses are conducted by correspondence. They cover every aspect of the history of the Negro race, its economic progress, its social problems, African art, African anthropology, and African philosophy. Some of the most distinguished scholars of this country have been secured as instructors. The circular herein enclosed will give particulars. The undersigned will be delighted to answer further inquiries and will enroll anyone desiring to become a student. Here we have one of our most brilliant historians and educators over 100 years ago, decrying the fact that African history has been made into a non-issue by the white academic world. I tell you guys, as a historian, as an educator, we are in 2022. I challenge you to find any school, any college or university, I don't care if it's an HBCU, I challenge you to find one course in which ancient Egypt is taught as being created by Black African people. I challenge you to find one course in the United States of America in which African history is taught from antiquity. I challenge you. I challenge you. And one of the things that Dr. John Henry Clarke, Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, Dr. Obanga, Dr. Asa Hilliard, Dr. Anthony Browder, and so many of us have been trying to do is rescue our history from the bin of propaganda. We are the only ones to do this. And it's important for us to understand this. What you're going to be taught through this lecture series, you are not going to be taught in school. Your kid doesn't know this. And what you don't know will hurt you. What we don't know has been destroying us. History of the world. If human beings originated in Africa over 200,000 years ago, and now we're at 300,000 years ago. And let's look at our timeline again. Let's take it further back. Human history begins here. Human beings are in Africa and Africa alone, all the way up until around 130,000 BC. So here you're talking about human beings only existing on the continent of Africa for 170,000 years on the continent of Africa. Think about this now. All human beings for 170,000 years plus, all human beings are African people on the continent of Africa for 170,000 years. Let's start to think, what knowledge would be generated over the course of 170,000 years? Right now, we're only experiencing 6,000 years of human history. 6,000 years. We're in the 2000s AD, and the oldest civilization's around 5,000 here. So you thought, let's say 7,000 years of human history. 7,000 years of human history as we know it versus 170,000 years. How much accumulated knowledge do you think happened in the course of 170,000 years? Now, we're going to look at the hominid species that came before we did. There are 8 other species that came before human beings. We had Homo habilis, the handyman. This is 2.4 million to 1.4 million years ago. Okay. In 1960, a team of researchers uncovered fossilized remains of an early human in Tanzania. This is in Africa. These fossils had brain cases slightly larger than those of apes. Suspecting that these specimens were responsible for the thousands of stone tools found near the site, scientists dubbed the species handyman, hence Homo habilis. Okay, habilis means handyman. All right. Homo habilis was small, clocking in around 70 pounds and standing somewhere between 3.5 feet and 4.5 feet tall. Next, we have Homo erectus. Okay, this is one who you guys are familiar with. This is the first hominid who's standing upright. All right. Now, as the name implies, Homo erectus is the first known Homo species that stood fully upright. Homo erectus featured other modern human proportions distinct from those of apes, shorter arms relative to the torso, and long legs adapted for walking and running rather than climbing trees. Homo erectus is the first human with a significantly larger brain case than that of apes. They also had smaller teeth. I'm going to move on to Homo erectus was a very successful species. They walked the earth for a long period, lasting nearly 9 times as long as our current reign. So the species of Homo erectus walked the planet way longer than regular human beings have been on this planet. Okay? Then you get Homo rudolfensis, which was named after the person who found the remains. Kenya's lake, named after Kenya's Lake Rudolph, known as Lake Turkana. Then you got Heidelbergensis. Then you got I'm horrible with these names. Last but not least, you have Neanderthals. Neanderthals are an interesting member of the hominid group. When you think about Neanderthals, what we were taught were that Neanderthals were what? Dumb, stupid, cavemen, so on and so forth. Well, today, scientists have been able to fully decipher the Neanderthal genome. And what they learned is rather shocking. And I'm going to read to you real quick what they learned. Because a lot of this stuff that you're going to be reading are things that were said by other black radicals, radical leaders, and historians and things of that nature, but no one took it seriously. No one took it seriously until white scientists confirmed. And that is, why is this not coming up? I'm sorry, I'm having some computer problems. Here you have from the Natural History Museum of London, the pros and cons of dating a Neanderthal. Interbreeding with Neanderthals gave some of our ancestors distinctive skin and hair, but also left behind a legacy of disease within our DNA. Listen carefully. Non-African people today, and let me say that again, let me read that again. Non-African people today carry Neanderthal DNA in their genetic makeup that is associated with changes in hair and skin, but also with diseases such as diabetes, Crohn's, and even conditions such as chronic depression and addictive behavior. Modern humans began to leave Africa around 60,000 years ago, encountering Neanderthals as they moved into Eurasia. Studies in the past few years showed that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals, albeit rarely. Now, before 2014, if you were to say to me that Europeans made it with Neanderthals and that all modern Europeans have Neanderthal DNA in them today, if a black African historian would have came and said that to you, you would have said that has no credibility. Now that it is a fact, what does that mean for the human species? What does that mean for the human species? When you have people from the same genus, but a different species mating. Look what it said, modern human beings who have this Neanderthal DNA in them. They actually were able to point to defects within this DNA structure. So that means that if you're living today and you are experiencing or you have in your DNA Neanderthal DNA, that Neanderthal DNA was not recessive. Your DNA was recessive. That is the only way that Neanderthal DNA will still have presence today. So I say all that to say, when we think about the personality of human beings, when we think about the personality development of other races of human beings, that is when we begin to see how human beings differ. You can talk all you want to talk about all human beings came from Africa. That is true. That is true. But when human beings left Africa, when human beings left the warmth of the African climate, when they left the abundance of the African environment and moved into places, to environments that were the opposite, there was an opposite in personality development. This is very critical because while everybody wants to do the kumbaya, oh, we all come from Africa, or we all come from Africa, so we all the same, that is half true. We all come from Africa, but our personality development as races are shaped by the environmental forces that we were born and raised in. Let me give you an example. Human beings originate in Africa. The African climate is suitable for human beings to thrive, so much so that here we are today, the masters of the planet. Even though we were not the strongest, biggest other predators around, we're the masters. African people on the continent of Africa, while they were in Africa and Africa exclusively, they didn't have to fight over resources. You got plenty of fresh water. You got plenty of vegetation. You got food everywhere. When you start looking at the rock art, which we're going to be studying next, which precedes all of these civilizations that we be talking about, what you're going to see is them drawing an abundance of animals. Animals, 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 animals. What you see from the rock art is a level of genius in terms of people who can paint and draw. What you see on the rock art, which is older than ancient Kemet, are the people who showed the people of ancient Kemet how to make paint that lasts forever. Because the paint on the rocks, it's still there as well, outside, weathering, and the paint is still there. So again, when you study history from the origins of humanity, you begin to learn and appreciate the civilization of ancient Kemet as not something that sprung forth from nowhere, but there were literally over 100+ thousands of years of human development in Africa that gave rise to the level of knowledge that was interpreted in ancient Kemet through the civilization of ancient Kemet. So again, when you look at this timeline, I want you to remember, ancient Kemet is here, 3150 BC. The Greeks are here, 900 BC. The Romans are here, 30 BC. Islam is all the way over here, 610 AD. All right? So all the things that we're talking about right now, the Western world was not even here. There was no Europeans. There was only African people, African culture. If you are born in a land where you have tons of fresh water, tons of food, why would you go and try to conquer someone else's territory? What would be your motivation to do so? What would have been an African's motivation to go over into the Levant, which is the present-day Middle East, and conquer people who are living on sand, who have no culture, who have no real wealth, who have no civilization, just barbarian? Why would I do that? Why, as an African, would I go over into Europe, across the Mediterranean, in a freezing environment that does not allow you to produce any, food easily? You can't even barely be outside. So you are living in caves. Life is perilous. Your whole relationship now to another human being is markedly different than the relationship of an African to another African. Why? Because the other African is not in competition for resources. When you look at Europe, you're in a frozen tundra. What type of tool are you going to need in order to dig in the solid frozen ground? How big of an animal is going to roam the plains of Europe when there's nothing there to eat because it's freezing cold? What herd animals do you know of that are native to Europe? What plants, what fruits and vegetables do you know that are native to Europe? Virtually nothing. So why would an African person leave Africa to go to Europe when there's nothing there? Why would an African person go to the Levant, to the Middle East, and try to conquer those people that don't have anything when we have everything? I want you to follow me, because a lot of this stuff is common sense. It's common sense. But when you don't have a professor like me teaching you this, when you got a white professor jumping the timeline to all the way up here to when white people are in power and they erase all of this, you don't know anything about this, what are you to think? What are you to think? And this is why this lecture series is so important. This is why the Education for Life Academy curriculum is so important. This is why Black historians are so important. Because we are the only people who are going to provide you, your children, and the Black world with a real understanding of who we are, one that does not need any embellishments whatsoever. I can sit and teach you African history for years and years and years without embellishing anything, because who we are, the evidence shows, are just remarkable people. Let me give you an example. The bow and arrow was created 64,000 years ago in Africa. Here that is right here, way down here, 64,000 years ago. Now, how long was the bow and arrow the most sophisticated weapon and tool in the ancient world? All the way up until the gun. When I ask you simple questions like, who are if human beings were first originated in Africa 300,000 years ago, who would be the first people to see a log float on a river? An African person. So now you see, damn, this something is this heavy, but it's floating on water? Let's see if we can get on it and float and take it and get on the river and go somewhere else. Okay, it works, but it's uncomfortable. Let's see if we can dig the inside out so we can have more comfort when we in it. That's the first canoe. First canoe ain't come from South America, from Western Americas. That necessarily has to be in Africa. Who do you think was the first human being to see fire and to capture fire? Who? Do you think human beings lasted for 100 and something thousand years without knowing how to do these things, how to harness fire, how to create weapons that will allow them to not be a food for all of the big predators on the planet? Let's look at Africans growing up on the continent of Africa, speaking of that. We're all human beings in Africa. Look at all the huge herd animals in Africa. Look at all of the huge predatory animals in Africa. Can we exist and live effectively individually by ourselves? No. We as human beings are working together to subdue larger prey, to ensure our survival. And we are collectively feeding ourselves off of our group kills. When you go over into Europe, that changes. Ain't no herd animals. Now you ain't got nothing but a whole bunch of rabbits and stuff like that. So now we're in a competition for resources. We're in a forest, not a jungle. We're in a forest. What weapons do we have? What tools do we have? So now if I go kill a rabbit, am I trying to share that rabbit with another human being? No. In fact, I may have to kill you from taking my rabbit because you're dying of starvation. A totally different personality development based on environment. And I'm going to keep bringing this up because this is critical to understanding the nature of the African. Because if you can truly understand the nature of the African, you can appreciate how the African finds her and himself in this position today. And how others who have demonstrated less genius than us, who are the youngest members of the human family, are in power. It's not because they're smarter than us. Asian Americans don't have the highest GPAs and SAT scores because they are innately superior to everyone else. They have a culture that prizes education above all. And therefore they study the most. Their children still respect their parents. Their children still go do the homework like their parents tell them. And that's why they get good grades. There's nothing innate. But when you're talking about personality development, This is something that we have to really critical understand if we're going to come to liberation. If we're going to come to liberation. But I'm going to close today's lecture. We'll be here again on Thursday at 8 p.m. and it'll also be live stream on the Black Achievement Fund's YouTube page. Just go to YouTube and type in the Black Achievement Fund and you'll be able to find us. And we're going to have fun. We're going to have fun learning about who we really are. We're going to have fun tearing apart all of this propaganda that African people contribute nothing to world history, that only white people have done anything worthwhile. Because this is what we're fighting. And we have been losing that battle for as long as since I was a kid. To the day we have a Black Achievement Fund. And you have black people in 2022 who, for reasons of propaganda, don't even believe that other black people can unify and accomplish the same things that other races have done. Even though we created the most magnificent civilization that every other civilization known to man copied from. Even though we developed spirituality, the religion that everyone practices, that came from Africa. How can a people who are being raised in a frigid environment with no resources, day to day struggling to survive, how are they going to develop spirituality? I'm just asking you guys to use a little bit of logic. Just use logic. What would propel you to want to pray and think of God? When as far as you're concerned, God has cursed you with this land. African people, we are the oldest human beings on this planet. The DNA of African people is the oldest DNA on the planet. All of the brilliance that African people cultivated over 100 and something thousand years sitting in Africa, learning in Africa, is still in the DNA of African Americans. We just have to unlock who we are. Unlocking who we are, unpacking all of this propaganda will allow us to be who we must be in the future, and that is to rise back to the top of world power. I'm going to stop the lecture for today. I'm going to try to keep this lecture series between an hour and an hour and a half each time, because I know it's pretty late, but I'm doing it at 8 p.m. because I want to accommodate a lot of our members that we have on the West Coast. All right, so please come back next Thursday, same time, 8 p.m. If you would like to see this lecture over again, just go to the Black Achievement Fund's YouTube page, and it will be there tomorrow. And I will see you guys soon, unless there is someone who has been watching, any of our members who want to make any comments or anything before we go.
Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you guys enjoyed our presentation, the lecture today. Please come back next Thursday. We're going to start showing a lot of slideshows of a lot of images that prove without a shadow of a doubt who the first people who began all of the pioneering in sciences and architecture and art and sculpture and everything. You're going to begin to learn who they are. And not a surprise, they're African people. So check us out next week. We're going to continue our study, and we are all the way at the back of the timeline. All right, so you're not going to be hearing anything about slavery and all of those things. Everything you're going to be hearing is pretty empowering. All right, so see you guys next Thursday, same time, same place. Peace.